All right, so on top of understanding the different regions of the human body, we also need to master directional terms. So we use these terms to locate portions of the body, to describe regions in the body, to identify different markings. Sometimes these terms are used in the names of muscles, bone markings. We use these terms a lot throughout this entire semester. So, the faster that we can understand these terms, the better off we're going to be. All right. Now, the cool thing about directional terms is that they usually have an opposite. All right. So, let's start with superior, right? So, superior hopefully sounds familiar to you. When I think of superior, I think of like a superior being, all right? So, they are on top of the world, and that's what superior means, towards the head or the upper portion of a structure, towards the top, okay? Now, again, there's always going to be an opposite. So, the opposite of that would be number 3, inferior. Okay, so inferior is literally the opposite, away from the head or the lower part of a structure, lower portion of a bone, lower portion of, whatever we're referring to in the body. Okay, so it's fun because they have these opposites. So if you know one and you know what it's paired up with, you'll be able to identify or remember the definition. Okay, now, number 2, we kind of skipped. Number 2, cranial. We've already actually talked about cranial. Let's go back a few slides. Cranial is literally referring to the skull, okay? Cranial is referring to the head, okay? So if a portion of the body is cranial, it's on the head, all right? Now, the opposite of that would be number 5, caudal. Right, so caudal is referring to below the head. Really, the direct definition is tail end. Now, we don't really have a tail end, not anymore, but it's really just referring to anything like below the neck and down to the feet. Okay, that would be caudal. Now, number 4 is weird. Okay, number 4 doesn't really have an opposite actually. And it's also not used a lot. We I don't use this. Okay. I almost thought about crossing it off, but we'll go over it. So rostral, number 4. This is referring to towards the nose on the head. All right. So if a structure is more so towards the nose, it would be considered rostral. We rarely use that, but the more you know. Okay. So, really, the ones that we use the most out of that first 5 are number 1 and number 3. Okay. So, superior and inferior. Top versus bottom. Towards the head, towards the feet. Okay. Number 6 and number 7, they are opposites. Anterior is referring to the front of the body, or even just near or closer to the front of the body. Posterior is the opposite, referring to the back of the body or closer to the back of the body. All right. Now, ventral and dorsal. When we are referring to the human body, we can use ventral and dorsal and anterior and posterior interchangeably. Ventral literally means towards the belly. Okay, ventral means towards the belly. So, ventral and anterior in the human body are often interchangeable. Okay, posterior and dorsal often interchangeable. Dorsal means backside. So, posterior means towards the back, dorsal means backside. So, of course, in the human body, both of those terms can be interchangeable. Now, I'm going to do a little sketch for y'all. Okay, so oh wow. Oh no. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that's a cat. Or a dog, whatever. It's a quadruped. Okay, it's an organism that, is on all four legs or limbs. Okay. So, with quadrupeds, the terms anterior and ventral, posterior and dorsal are no longer interchangeable, okay? Because we got to go back down to the root of the definition. Anterior means front of the body. So yeah, we can call this anterior. Posterior means towards the back of the body. Okay, here it is. Tail side. Awesome. All right. Ventral means towards the belly. Well, the belly of a quadruped is over here. Okay. And dorsal means backside. And the backside is where the spinal column is. Okay. Which would be right here. So, anterior and ventral, interchangeable when referring to humans. Posterior and dorsal, interchangeable when referring to humans. Otherwise, we kind of have to remember that organization. Okay. We can also go back to this slide and see this here. So anterior, front, posterior, back, dorsal on this top portion, superior, right? Ventral on this bottom portion, inferior. So it even is not interchangeable when we're looking at organs. Okay. Oops, we're not done here. Okay, so number 10 and 11, opposites. Medial is referring to that midline. Remember, the midline is this imaginary vertical line separating the body into left and right. Equal portions of left and right. Okay. Lateral refers to going away from the midline. All right. Away from the midline. Intermediate. This is opposite with nothing, unfortunately. So 12 is an exception. Intermediate is really just referring to something that's between structures, between two different structures. Okay, the intermediate of it all. All right. Number 13 and 14, these guys are opposites. Ipsilateral. Ipsilateral is referring to a structure that's on the same side of the body. Same side of the body. So, an example of ipsilateral, we have the gallbladder and a portion of the large intestine called the ascending colon. Those are both on the same side of the body, right? Contralateral is referring to on opposite sides of the body. So we use the word contralateral specifically when we're looking at the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. So the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. Those are on opposite sides of the body, contralateral. Proximal and distal, 15 and 16, are opposites. Proximal is referring to the portion of the structure that is closer to the trunk of the body. Okay, proximal, closer to the trunk. And remember, the trunk is this whole center portion where the limbs connect to. Okay, distal is referring to portion of the structure that is further away from the trunk. So proximal, closer to the trunk, distal, further away from the trunk. The thing about 15 and 16, the thing about proximal and distal, is that these are really only used when you're referring to your limbs, either upper limbs or lower limbs, which kind of makes sense because the limbs connect to the trunk. So proximal, closer to the trunk, on the limb. Distal, further away from the trunk, on the limb. Okay, 17 and 18, opposites. Superficial is referring to towards the surface or even on the surface of the body, whereas deep is referring to away from the surface of the body. Okay. And 19 and 20, again, opposites. External, outside of the body, internal, inside of the body. Those are really general terms that aren't typically used too much, but can be. Okay. So those are your directional terms, and we use these to describe the body in regard to other structures. So here we can see, let's do first, all right, here's superior, towards the top, towards the head, inferior, towards the feet, below the head, all right? We are looking at the front of the person, so that means that this would be the anterior view or the ventral view because we're talking about a human body. All right. Also note that they are in anatomical position because the thumbs are facing away from the midline. The thumbs are facing laterally. Right? So the thumbs are moving away from the midline, so we call them lateral. Whereas the pinkies over here, they're facing towards the midline. So they would be referred to medial compared to the thumb. All right. So medial is towards this midline, that center portion of the body that separates the body into equal left and right portions, cutting along a mid-sagittal plane. Lateral is moving away from the midline. Now, proximal and distal, again, I said were used to describe limbs. So here we're looking at the upper limb, right? So proximal, going towards the trunk, distal, away from the trunk. Yay! Okay, and also in this image, we have some of these organs and structures and bones identified for you. Probably worth your while to just kind of go over some of these major structures, right? So, if you remember, I said for the ipsilateral, which means, again, on the same side of the body, I said it was the gallbladder and the ascending colon. So see how they're on the same side of the body. But we could also look at the ascending colon versus the descending colon, right? One side of the body, the other side of the body. So that would make it contralateral. Okay. If you were to compare the ribs and the lungs, you could say the ribs are superficial compared to the lungs, or vice versa. The lungs are deep to the ribs, right? Because superficial is moving towards the surface and deep is going away from the surface. All right. So I do have a question for you. All right. And this would be a question that you could or should submit. All right. So this is referring to the regions of the body. All right. So kind of test yourself before you check for the answer. All right. The buccal region is blank to the sural region. All right, so the buccal region is blank to the sural region. So, what directional term would be best to use to describe those two regions, their relationship to each other? The buccal region is blank to the sural region. All right, so let's move on to one of my, I get really jazzed about some random portions of anatomy. The body cavities, one of those things that I get really jazzed about. So this is so cool. So not only does the body get broken into different regions, but we also have these cavities within the body. Okay, but it's really easy if we just follow the bolded portions first. Okay, so let's start dorsal, all right, which also can mean posterior. On the dorsal, or in the dorsal body cavity, we have the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Okay, now the thing about these cavities, I should probably say that before we get into anything else. The thing about the cavities is that these are actually spaces, and they're usually outlined by bone or muscle. Okay, so there's going to be organs inside of these cavities. And so once we start going into these different organ systems, we'll be able to identify the organs and then also relate it back to, okay, well, what cavity did that belong to? Or was it found in? All right. So looking again at the dorsal body cavity, we have the cranial cavity. So this is just a space. All right. And it's formed by the bones in the skull, and it's going to house the brain. And then we also have the vertebral cavity, again, a space that's going to be formed by the vertebral column, and it's going to contain the spinal cord. All right, so that's the dorsal body cavity. Easy start. Let's go to the ventral. So ventral also means anterior. Okay, so we can see this is from an anterior view. All right, in the ventral cavity, we have two subcavities. So kind of like you could bracket it down, right? Ventral cavity, and then break it down. One side is the thoracic cavity. The other one is the abdominal pelvic cavity. Those are our two subcavities of the ventral cavity. Now, of course, those subcavities get broken down even further, so let's dive into it. So let's talk about the thoracic cavity. So this is shown mostly in purple, but not just in purple. All right. So in the thoracic cavity, what we're really looking at is the chest cavity. Okay, so this is going to be composed of, our ribs, okay, and our sternum. Our sternum is that front anterior plate that sits kind of medial on our trunk. Okay, so in the thoracic cavity, we have the mediastinum cavity. Okay, so mediastinum cavity. So this is going to be this central portion of the thoracic cavity, and it's going to be between the lungs. Okay, so in the mediastinum cavity, it's going to contain the heart, the thymus, esophagus, trachea, and a lot of large blood vessels. Okay, it's really just a central portion of this thoracic cavity. Now, on the sides of the thoracic cavity, or the lateral portions of the thoracic cavity, right? Because it's moving away from the midline. Okay, so on the sides here, we have in purple, we have the pleural cavity. Okay, pleural cavity. So we have a left pleural cavity and a right pleural cavity. Okay, so this is essentially the space where we're going to have lungs. Okay, so these are where our left and our right lungs are going to be housed. Now, lastly, in the thoracic cavity, we have the pericardial cavity. So the pericardial cavity is actually kind of in the mediastinum, right? The mediastinum is not just the orange. The mediastinum is the entire center portion of the thoracic cavity. So the pericardial cavity is within the mediastinum. So the pericardial cavity is again a space because it's a cavity, and it's going to surround the heart. All right. So that is the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity is going to be separated from the inferior cavity, still belonging to the ventral cavity, but the abdominopelvic cavity is inferior to the thoracic, and it's separated by a structure called the diaphragm. Now, technically in this view, It's not even drawn in, but it would be sitting right here, where the line is and where I'm tracing with my mouse. Okay, so the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity are separated by the diaphragm, right? Both of those are subcavities of the ventral cavity. So luckily for us, the abdominal pelvic cavity doesn't get broken into anything too complex like the thoracic cavity. We just have two portions here. Okay, it gets divided into the abdominal cavity here, seen in pink, and the pelvic cavity seen here in green. Now, the abdominal cavity is going to be really containing most of the digestive system organs like the intestines, the gallbladders, liver, spleen, stomach. And it's not really protected by it's not really protected by bone as the thoracic cavity was, right? Thoracic cavity was protected by the ribs and the sternum. Abdominal cavity, it's protected mostly by abdominal muscles. Okay, so then we have the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is going to contain most of our urinary system structures as well as our reproductive structures. And it's also going to be protected by our pelvic girdle, which are what we colloquially know as our hip bones. But we'll talk about that more when we get to the skeletal unit. Okay, so the pelvic cavity is protected by the pelvic girdle. All right. So I just get really jazzed about these cavities. I don't know why. Really fun to see different ways that the body is kind of broken down. All right. Now, it doesn't stop there, right? Looking at the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have more structures to identify, which we refer to as serous membranes. Okay, serous membranes. So let's just define this really quick. The serous membrane is going to cover the walls and organs in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. All right. Now, a serous membrane has two layers. Those layers are going to create a space where fluid can flow. All right, so let's talk about that. All right. The parietal layer is what's going to line the walls of the body cavity. The visceral layer literally touches and covers the organ. Okay? Now, I think that this example right here it's just such a great visual. Okay, everybody's blown up a balloon probably, or held a balloon, or seen a balloon in their life. Okay, I want to picture a water balloon. All right, so a little water balloon that we can hold in our hand, and we're going to make a fist. Okay, and we're going to kind of punch down or press down onto that water balloon, but we're not going to pop it. That's not the goal. Okay, so the portion of that balloon, the rubber, the plastic that is touching you as you're kind of punching into the balloon, that is going to be the visceral layer. Because let's pretend that your hand here is the organ and this portion of the balloon is touching your hand. Okay, so that would be the visceral layer. And then you can kind of see it loops. All right, and now this outer portion, this is going to be that it's interacting with the outside world, not really touching the actual organ. That's going to be the parietal layer. That's going to be lining the wall of the body cavity. And then we can think about the water that is being displaced in the balloon, right? So that we actually refer to as serous fluid, or if there's not a fluid, we could just call it the serous space. This is just really the portion between the parietal and the visceral layers. All right. So I love that balloon example because I feel like we've all held a balloon or seen a balloon. All right. So it's really easy to kind of envision this visceral versus parietal and kind of understand how it's all continuous. It's only different when, okay, this portion is touching the organ and this portion is touching the outside world, is touching the body cavity. All right. Now let's relate this back to the organs and cavity walls of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So, in the body, there are actually only 3 serous membranes. We have 2 in the thoracic and 1 in the abdominal pelvic. All right. So, let's first talk about the pleural serous membrane. Okay. So, remember, the pleural cavity is where we're going to be housing the lungs. So, the pleura membrane is going to be surrounding the lungs, and we have 1 for each lung. So, I guess we have 4 serous membranes because 2 lungs. Anyways, 3 types of serous membranes. Okay. Now, we can also remember that in the thoracic cavity, we have the pericardial cavity, which again is within the mediastinum, and it's going to be housing the heart. So the pericardium is going to be the serous membrane that surrounds the heart. Now, this one's it's not, as nice, right? The pleura was in the pleural cavity. The pericardium is in the pericardial cavity. Well, in the abdominal cavity, or abdominal pelvic cavity rather, we have the peritoneum. Okay, so it's not as nice, but it still flows. All right, so the peritoneum is the serous membrane that's going to surround a lot of organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so 2 of these membranes are in the thoracic, and this 1 peritoneum is in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So here on this image, this would be, of course, the lung. All right, so this would be the right lung. And I can see that in purple, this light purple, this would be the actual organ. So lung, right? The darker purple that's kind of surrounding it, that would be the visceral layer. And then the yellow or orange, that's the space, that's the serous space or serous fluid. And then this outer portion, that's going to be the parietal layer. Okay, and then here we can also see the ribs protecting the organs and the diaphragm below, kind of outlining that thoracic cavity. Okay, so here is a really cool view. Look at this. This is the view of the body, right? So this is a transverse plane. Okay, so we're separating it in top and bottom. So we're actually looking through this plane at the top portion. Okay, so it's almost like we are looking up into this person's, pectoral region, into their chest. Okay, so we have the pleura, right, which would be the serous membrane going over the lungs in the pleural cavity. Now, because we have this visceral and parietal layer, we can't just say parietal and visceral because that could be applied to any of these membranes. We got to be specific. So we're going to call it the parietal pleura or visceral pleura. All right, so again, the visceral pleura touching the lung, parietal pleura surrounding the lung, touching the body cavity wall. And then, of course, it does leave a space. This would be a cavity because this is a cadaver, so there is no fluid, right? So it would be the pleural cavity. Okay. Over here, we have the pericardium. Remember, the pericardium is the serous membrane that surrounds the heart, and we're in the pericardial cavity, right? So instead of just saying parietal and visceral, we're going to say parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium. And again, we have that cavity. So we can see The parietal pericardium interacts with the body cavity wall. The visceral pericardium is right directly on the heart. If we were to hold the heart, we would be physically touching the visceral pericardium. Okay, when you hold a heart in lab or a model of a heart, imagine that you are touching the visceral pericardium. Okay, so just another view, I think a little better view of these two structures, right? So here we have the heart. So we're in the pericardial cavity. And we have the parietal pericardium interacting with the outside wall. And also it connects onto the diaphragm, which is seen here, really clear view of the diaphragm. And if we were to touch the heart again, we would see the visceral pericardium and feel the visceral pericardium. The pleura, these are the lungs over here. Not the best view of the lungs, but again, the visceral pleura is covering the lungs. The parietal pleura is kind of actually interacting and covering the parietal pericardium, but that's cool. Yeah. You can also see it surrounding it here, interacting with the body cavity wall here, right? And it also kind of connects onto the diaphragm, right? So pericardium, heart, pleura, lungs. We've got to remember to be specific: visceral pleura, parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium. Okay, and then also remember which body cavities these are found in.